to start the seminar today. My name is Helen Alexander, and maybe I should take my mask off to make this easier for you to listen to me. I'm a professor here at KU, and I'm really looking forward to welcome Leland Russell, who's our speaker today. Leland is at Wichita State University, so not too far away. And he's a plant ecologist. He comes from a great tradition, worked with Norma Fowler at University of Texas and stellata at Nebraska. And what his main research interest is looking at how herbivores, insects and mammals feeding on plants, how they interact with plant populations and communities. And so he works in the Cross Timbers region. I'm sure he'll share details about that. But it's a wonderful area, Wichita and further places south into Oklahoma and Texas. And I feel so fortunate that he hosted Dean Kettle and I visiting and walking around a great open woodland maintained by fire down there just about a month ago. The title of his talk is Deer Herbivory, Light Availability and Tree Regeneration in the Kansas Cross Timbers. Welcome, Leland.
Well, thank you very much, Helen. I really appreciate the invitation. It's a lot of fun to be here. And I've really enjoyed interacting with you as you've written your book or writing your book and and talking about cross timber systems. Oops. Yeah. So today, I'm going to tell you about a number of projects that my students and I have been doing in the Kansas Cross Timbers region, particularly having to do with understanding factors that are affecting oak regeneration in the Cross Timbers region, especially deer herbivory and light availability as a function of canopy gaps. Try this again. Okay, there we go. So, as I said, today I'm going to be talking with you about deer herbivory and oak regeneration in the Kansas Cross Timbers. But as Helen mentioned, research in my lab generally focuses upon effects of herbivores on individual plants and plant populations. So my students and I address effects of herbivores upon individual plant performance, survival rates, growth rates, fecundities, lifetime seed production, those kinds of things. My students and I also address herbivore effects upon plant population dynamics, so the role of herbivores in limiting plant population growth rates. And one topic that is of particular interest to me and my students is trying to understand the large spatial and temporal variation in herbivore damage to plants and herbivore effects on plants that seems to characterize most plant-herbivore interactions. And today we're talking about deer and oaks, but the other study system that's a major focus in my lab are insect herbivores and thistles. And this is one system I picked up from my postdoc advisor at University of Nebraska, sabbatical. My students and I work on tall thistle, which is one of our primary native thistles in eastern Kansas, along with wavy leaf thistle, and the role that insect herbivores play in limiting populations of tall thistle. A long-running experiment that my colleague Greg Hausman and I have at Wichita State's field station, a little southwest of Wichita, looks at the role of soil nutrient availability and different types of herbivores, insect herbivores, above ground mammals, below ground mammals, their roles in affecting plant community composition and population dynamics of tall thistle. It was fortunate for me that when we started this experiment, tall thistle was the most ubiquitous forb in our plots. And then I also have research, students and I have research along with my postdoc advisor, Svacha, we're working on the population dynamics and insect thistle interactions on this plant, flat thistle. Svatcha spent much of her career studying the insect herbivore flat thistle interactions in the range center of that species in the Nebraska sandhills, and we're repeating those experiments at the southwestern edge of the species range in south central Colorado. So today, first I want to talk about, sort of introduce you to the topic, which is oak regeneration failure, at least oak regeneration insufficiency, and two hypothesized causes for this failure, insufficiency of oak regeneration. Then I want to give you a brief introduction to the cross timbers vegetation, the cross timbers ecosystem, which is our study system. Then I want to talk about three projects, and the projects 1 and 3 emerged from the master's thesis of a former graduate student of mine, Beverly Corey. And Bev graduated in, I think, 2017, and I've continued collecting data, at least on project 3. And then project 2 is the result of undergraduate research by Justin Minette and Noah Kashkarian. So the first project is to quantify the Canopy Gap regime in Kansas cross timbers woodlands, and we're making a comparison between relatively old and relatively young woodlands. There's reason to think that the age of the woodland might affect the gap regime, having to do with the size of the trees that are present, sort of heterogeneity in the structure of the canopy, those kinds of things. The second project looks at browsing preferences among different cross timbers tree species and spatial patterns in deer browse in relation to habitat edges, and finally associational effects, the possibility that the species composition of other saplings surrounding a post oak sapling might influence the extent to which it's browsed by deer. And then the final project is an experiment that looks at the joint effects of light availability and deer browsing on the performance, survival, and growth of the dominant oak species in the cross timbers post oak. So oaks are a foundation species in many Eastern North American forests and woodlands. And this paper by Hanbury and Nowacki I found fascinating. They use general land office records, and in particular, this table has to do with witness tree data to show sort of the historical representation of oaks in East Central North American forests as compared to a number of other, tree genera we think of as important, like pines and hickories and chestnuts historically. And the point they're making is that in many of these forest provinces of Eastern North America, over 50% of the witness trees were oaks. Okay, and no other genus of tree, except for pines on the southeastern coastal plain, comes anywhere close to that. So oaks, they make the argument that oaks were the foundation genus of Eastern North American forests, first of all, based upon the overwhelming abundance of oaks. And another component of being a foundation species or a foundation genus is that you exercise a lot of influence over other members of the community. And that's certainly true of oaks. The oak canopy can have a large influence upon the understory species composition and upon the animals that are there. And Van Dersel in 1940 came up with a list of 186 North American bird and mammal species that feed upon oaks. And this doesn't, of course, even include insects for whom oaks are tremendously important. So historically, oaks really have been a foundation genus in many Eastern North American forests. The problem, at least the current problem, is that in many oak-dominated ecosystems throughout Eastern North America, there is a failure, or at least an insufficiency, of oak regeneration. There doesn't seem to be enough oak regeneration to replace the oaks that are currently in the canopy as those canopy oaks die off. And these are age structures for an oak, Quercus bucklei, that occurs on the western edge of the Edwards Plateau in central Texas. This was data I collected during my dissertation with Norma Fowler at University of Texas. Collected this data in the mid to late 1990s. And what these age structures really illustrate for the Spanish oak was that you had a recruitment, a wave of recruitment in the early to mid 20th century, okay? And then in the mid to late 20th century, you had very, very little oak recruitment in these populations. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about with regard to oak regeneration failure, or at least insufficiency of regeneration. what might be causing this? Well, there are a number of hypotheses for why oak regeneration may be insufficient, but two hypotheses that get a lot of attention or that are pretty widespread are first that oak regeneration failure is a function of reduced fire frequencies and reduced fire intensities in eastern North America, which in turn affects the abundance of species that are competitors for light with oak. And then another widespread hypothesis for oak regeneration failure insufficiency is intense browsing by historically large white-tailed deer populations. So let's take a look at each of these hypotheses in turn. With regard to the first one, the idea that oak regeneration failure is a function of changes in fire regime, as a function of the eastern portion of North America becoming less pyrogenic over time. The idea here is that with altered fire regimes, with less fire and less intense fires, that's provide an opportunity for competitors of oak that are less fire tolerant but more shade tolerant, what we sometimes refer to as mesophytic species, to recruit in abundance. And as those more mesophytic, more shade tolerant species recruit in abundance, they shade out the oak regeneration, okay? So oaks tend to be relatively shade intolerant and relatively fire tolerant. And these mesophytic tree species, which have increased with a reduction in fire, tend to be fire intolerant but shade tolerant. And the classic example of a mesophytic species in eastern North America, or a mesophytic genus in eastern North America, are maples, like you see here. So what we're talking about with this mesification, this sort of shift, and it's kind of a positive feedback loop because these more mesophytic species produce litter that holds moisture to a greater extent than oak litter does. And so that further damps the fire regime. But these size structures from Pearl's study, and these are two sites in West Virginia, really illustrate what's going on with mesification and oak regeneration failure. When you look at the canopy of these two sites in West Virginia, you see the canopy is still dominated by oaks, with maples being a relatively small component of the canopy. But then when you look at the sapling layer, it's exclusively, well, what we can say is there are no oaks, essentially, and there are a lot of maples. There are oak seedlings, so these adults are pumping out acorns, and those acorns are germinating and they're becoming seedlings, but they're not making it into the sapling size class. So this is oak regeneration failure, this is mesification. Now, this idea of mesification was really proposed by Nowak. Well, to my knowledge, it was proposed by Nowacki and Abrams. And the idea was that without fire, it would make the transition from oak-dominated ecosystems to mesophytic hardwood systems easier. But Nowacki and Abrams pointed out that on dry, nutrient-poor sites, it's possible that oak-dominated ecosystems would be stable. On these dry, nutrient-poor sites, they may simply be too dry for some of these mesophytic tree species. And so, whereas here in these two sort of diagrams over here, we can see that with fire and especially without fire, it's very easy for oak-dominated ecosystems to transition from savanna to woodland to forest and ultimately over into a mesophytic hardwood, and then it's virtually impossible to push them back to an oak-dominated ecosystem. On xeric sites, it may be more difficult to transition among these different states, and even more difficult, there's even greater barrier to push it over into a mesophytic hardwood system. So it gives some hope that maybe, at least on some of these drier sites, oak-dominated systems may be more stable. And as a result, dry sites have attracted some attention to really test this idea that oak systems may be more stable in the drier locations, or at least may not be subject to mesification. As I said, oaks are relatively shade intolerant, so something that's going to be really critical to the regeneration of oaks are going to be canopy gaps. Canopy gaps are locations where something has happened to the canopy trees, they've collapsed, they've flipped over, something like that. It creates a high light patch. And depending upon the size of the gap, it may create enough light to allow oak regeneration. So dry sites, canopy gaps, those may be locations where we may see some oak regeneration occurring. So the second hypothesis that I mentioned was that the insufficiency of oak regeneration or oak regeneration failure may be a function of historically large deer populations that are suppressing oak regeneration. And deer will consume acorns. Deer will also nip or browse the growing tips of oaks that are smaller than the browse line. And this figure right here shows harvest data for deer in Kansas between about 1965 through, I guess, 2017. You can see a large increase in harvest data. And this kind of tracks trends in deer populations in Eastern North America from the middle part of the 20th century into the 21st century. So in much of Eastern North America, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, deer were nearly extirpated as a result of very intense hunting. Laws were put into place to protect deer, and deer populations started to grow, and they grew throughout the middle part of the 20th century, and they got to very high densities in the later 20th century and into the 21st century. And while there's some debate about what deer density was like before the 19th century, I think most people think that deer densities today are considerably larger than they were or higher than they were even 200 years ago or so. This issue of the effects of white-tailed deer upon oaks or upon our Eastern North American forests is actually a case study in a much broader issue. And that much broader issue has to do with ungulate overpopulation in forest ecosystems worldwide. So this was a review that I found very interesting by Ramirez et al. They actually looked at studies of ungulate herbivores across forest ecosystems in the Northern Hemisphere. So this includes studies from North America, from Europe, Asia. It includes ungulates like white-tailed deer, like fallow deer, like red deer. I think they even had wild boar in a few studies. And basically what they did was, for all these studies, they did a review of when you had a situation where ungulates had lower density and higher density, what was the outcome of the comparison between low ungulate density and high ungulate density for a variety of measures of forest regeneration, forest structure, and forest functioning. And pretty consistently, when you had higher ungulate densities, the studies showed negative effects, as indicated by this bar right here, negative effects upon many aspects of forest regeneration, many aspects of forest structure, and many aspects of the ecosystem function of these forests, okay? So here we study the effects of white-tailed deer upon forests and woodlands of Eastern North America, but the insights we gain from that have much broader application to this issue of ungulate overabundance in forest ecosystems worldwide. So that brings us to our study system that we're going to be talking about today, and that is the cross timbers vegetation type. And it's a relatively small vegetation type in Kansas, but it's actually pretty extensive when you consider it across multiple states. So in this map, the pink area, starting down here in north central Texas, extending through North Texas, through eastern Oklahoma, and reaching this sort of northern terminus of a finger that comes up into Kansas, this is the cross timbers ecosystem, okay? And so the area that my students and I work in is this finger of cross timbers vegetation in southeastern Kansas. The cross timbers are described as a landscape mosaic of grasslands, oak savannas, and oak woodlands. And these are some images of what the cross timbers look like. This is a reasonably dense cross timber oak woodland at Woodson Wildlife Area in Woodson County, Kansas. And this is a glade, kind of an open area within that woodland, somewhat like the savannas might have looked like in the cross timbers. In addition to this sort of distinctive physiognomy, this landscape mosaic of grassland, savanna, and woodland, another feature that I think is distinctive of the cross timbers is how sort of species poor the canopy layer is. These woodlands are really dominated by two species, post oak, which will constitute maybe 60% of the canopy at many cross timber sites, and blackjack oak, which will constitute maybe 30% of the canopy at many cross timber sites. And then you have a smattering of hickories and Osage Orange and elms and those kinds of things, but it's really a rather species poor ecosystem when it comes to the canopy trees. Woods and wildlife area in particular looks to me like a species poor Ozarks. Rough topography, but not nearly the tree diversity that you see in forests further east. So now to tell you about the projects that my students and I have been doing in the cross timbers, this first project was a component of Beverly Corey's thesis. As I said, we were interested in canopy gaps because they're high light islands and might be locations where oaks would have an opportunity to regenerate. So one part of Bev's thesis was to quantify the canopy gap regime in old versus young cross timbers woodlands. And this comparison between old versus young woodlands was of interest to us for a number of reasons. Maybe some of you have been to Cross Timbers State Park in southeastern Kansas and heard about the ancient tree trail. Cross timbers have some of the oldest old growth forests, I guess, in eastern North America. These are trees that on the whole are of little economic value, so people don't cut them for lumber very often. And the topography is quite rough. So there's some areas that have really avoided being cutting, and you have some post oaks that are over 300 years old in the cross timbers. So that made old forests of interest. And there was also reason for us to think that canopy gap regime might be different between old versus young woodlands. Older woodlands are more heterogeneous, or could, in theory, could be more heterogeneous in the structure of their canopy, which might allow, greater wind turbulence that would have greater effect in blowing down trees. In older woodlands, you have trees that are closer to senescence, so that might lead to an increased frequency of gaps. Also, as trees get bigger, when they break, when they fall over, they could knock down other trees, altering the gap regime as well. So this comparison between young versus old woodlands was of interest to us. The research questions that Bev was addressing were, first of all, what is the canopy gap regime in Kansas cross timbers oak woodlands? How does the gap regime of these oak woodlands vary with stand age? And is the formation and filling of canopy gaps producing a change in tree species composition? Basically, is there a mismatch between the trees that are collapsing or breaking or tipping over to form the gap and the trees that are coming up in the gap, ultimately perhaps causing a turnover in the species composition of these woodlands? So what do we mean by canopy gap? This was something that Bev and I had to confront at the start, because as you walk through these woodlands, you'll see holes in the canopy. And is every place where two tree canopies don't come together, is that a canopy gap? Didn't seem like it should be to us. But we found this definition of a canopy gap by Runkle from 1982 that described a canopy gap as an opening in a forest canopy due to the death of a large branch, a single tree, or up to 10 trees, where active recruitment of new individuals into the canopy is occurring. And a key point here is that a gap has to have a gap former. To consider a gap, you have to have evidence that there was a tree there that died or tipped up or broke off that formed the gap. Because there are openings in these woodlands that have no obvious gap former and seem to be maybe perhaps some sort of edaphic blade or something like that. And I've also always found it interesting in this definition that Runkle sort of sets the upper limit for a gap at 10 trees. Once you get above 10 trees, Runkle considers that some sort of stand die-off rather than an actual gap. What do we mean by a gap regime? What are components of a gap regime? Well, components of a gap regime are, first of all, the frequency of gaps. And that can be measured as the gap fraction, meaning the proportion of the total area of the forest that is in gaps. Another way to measure it is the frequency of gaps along a linear transect, which is what we did. Another component of canopy gap regimes are the area of individual gaps. And one way to quantify the area of a canopy gap, of course, is to simply measure the area, to express it in square meters, something like that. But another very relevant way to express the size of a gap is the diameter to height ratio of a gap, because what you're really interested in with gaps is light availability. And two gaps that are of the same spatial extent can have very different light regimes depending upon the height of the surrounding canopy. So diameter to height ratio can be a very important way to express gap size. The shapes of gaps can be important. For example, long, narrow gaps may get more light penetration than circular gaps. And another component of gap regime that at least we find interesting is the causes of canopy gap. How are these gaps forming? So we sampled canopy gaps at 8 sites in the Kansas cross timbers, 4 of which we categorized as older and 4 of which we categorized as younger. These older sites, 3 of them were cored as part of the International Tree Ring Database, which is a database that's used for climatological purposes, for example. So they're looking for really old trees. They're looking for trees that can give them a long tree ring record. And these 3 sites were all used for that and documented instances of very old trees at those sites. So we were considering those to be our older woodland sites. And then Bev cored Quercus Scout Ranch. And we found that to have at least one mode of reproduction in probably the 1880s and 1890s, which made it a relatively old site, at least compared to our younger sites. And these younger sites were all cored by Bev or by another student of mine, Thomas Rogers. And the modal age classes there were from as young as 50 to 60 years up to 80 to 90 years. So there is some difference in the ages of these woodlands. We sampled gaps initially using a line intercept method, basically had a kilometer of transect at each site and sampled every gap that that transect passed through, which in some sense didn't turn out to be that many gaps. They weren't as common as we might have thought. And when the transect would pass through a gap, we would record characteristics of the gap, spatial extent, cause of the gap, those kinds of things. But particularly when it came to identifying the species that formed the gap, we got extremely small sample size. And that was because these gap formers deteriorate over time. If you want to know what species formed the gap, well, it can't be too deteriorated. So another undergrad, Noah Kashkarian, followed up on this, where he followed the same transects but sampled any gap he could see from the transect. So that expanded our sample size when it came to characteristics of the gap formers. Well, when it came to the effect of stand age, we really saw that there was very little difference in the gap regime between older, at least what we were categorizing older, and what we were categorizing as younger cross timber stands. When we look at the spatial extent of the gap as measured by square meters, gaps in old and young stands are pretty much intermixed. Okay, there isn't a lot of evidence that older stands have larger gaps or more gaps than younger stands. Also, when we look at causes of the gap, again, not a huge amount of differentiation, except perhaps in this category of standing dead trees causing the gap between old versus young woodlands. Something I want to point out here is for our analysis, we pooled tip overs with stump breaks, but tipping over is actually rather different, and I'll show you something interesting about tipping over in just a minute. So we thought it would be interesting to compare what we had learned about the canopy gap regime in the Kansas cross timbers with canopy gap regimes in other oak-dominated ecosystems in eastern North America. And there has been one other study that we're aware of the gap regime in cross timber system, which is Karki and Hallgren in Oklahoma from 2015. So when we look at the frequency of gaps here measured as gaps per linear kilometer of transect, gaps at our Kansas cross timber sites were pretty rare, okay? And it's quite interesting and a little surprising. They were a whole lot rarer than what Karki and Hallgren were finding in Oklahoma cross timber sites, and much more rare than in the Missouri Ozarks as well. When we looked at the sizes of gaps in the Kansas cross timbers, when you measure them in terms of square meters, are pretty small. And that's kind of consistent with what Karki and Hallgren found in the Oklahoma cross timbers, relatively small gaps, certainly much smaller than you find in the Missouri Ozarks and in oak-dominated ecosystems of the Southern Appalachians. But when you look at the Kansas cross timbers gaps in terms of diameter to height ratios, they're really not that small. And that's a function of the fact that the canopy is relatively short. These woodlands are truly woodlands, they're not forests. The canopy heights at these sites varied from about 10 meters to about 14 meters, whereas post oak can get to be 16 or 18 meters tall further east. So in terms of gap size and hence light availability, these Kansas cross timbers gaps are not so terribly small. As I mentioned, the trees in the Kansas cross timbers are relatively small trees. We see that in terms of the diameter breast height of the gap formers. Gap formers in the Kansas cross timbers are much smaller trees than the Southern Appalachians. And then this issue of tip-ups, which is what this last category is, the percent of gaps formed by tipping up. Tipping up is a whole lot less common mechanism of gap formation in the Kansas cross timbers than these other oak ecosystems. Only 6% of gaps were formed by trees tipping up. And I think that's interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, when a tree tips up, it falls over and it can knock down other trees, which could lead to larger gaps. And in terms of thinking about why this might be, soils are very, very thin in the Kansas cross timbers. So these trees may be putting their roots down into crevices in the underlying rock, which may make them more difficult to tip up. And I think another thing is these trees are short. So it would seem that if you had emergent trees that were sticking up above the rest of the canopy, they would be more vulnerable to be tipped over, but overall these trees are quite short. When we looked at the potential for changes in species composition of the canopy as a function of the formation and filling of gaps, basically what we did was we compared the frequency of different species in the canopy versus among gap creators, basically trees that died to form gaps, the frequency of different species among the gap creators as compared to those species within a gap that seem most likely to fill the gap based upon their current height. And then the comparison of the frequency distribution among different tree species in the canopy versus among the replacements. And there were some big disparities here, particularly with post oak. At our sites, post oak really dominated the current canopy. About 80% of the canopy was post oak. Post oak formed about 60% of the gaps. And post oak filled less than 30% of the gaps, okay? So it's still forming a lot of gaps, but it's filling a whole lot less gaps than it's forming. Blackjack oak was kind of fascinating in this regard. Blackjack oak was a relatively small component of the canopy at many of the sites we sampled, but it forms a very large proportion of gaps, and it fills almost as many gaps as it formed. Blackjack oak almost seems to have this high turnover rate associated with it. And one thing that is sort of a generality about the red oak subgenus, which includes the blackjack oaks, versus the white oak subgenus, which includes the post oaks, is the red oaks tend to be shorter lived. So a higher turnover rate might fit with that. And then we've got a few other species like shagbark hickory, this CAOV, eastern red cedar, other oaks, which are primarily other red oaks like northern red oak, Shumard oak, black oak, and then other tree species. And for these groups, they form a relatively small proportion of the canopy. They didn't form any gaps, and they fill gaps, okay? So it seems like the picture that might be emerging here is that through the gap formation and gap filling process over time, it might predict a decrease in the dominance of post oak and an increase in the dominance of some of these other species, perhaps particularly eastern red cedar, and maybe even some of the other red oaks as well. So our conclusions from this first study are that Kansas cross timbers woodlands are characterized by small, infrequent gaps that are formed primarily by stump breakage and standing dead, that stand age does not affect canopy gap regime in the Kansas cross timbers, and through gap formation and filling, canopy composition will shift towards less post oak dominance and greater representation of mesic oaks and non-oak species, okay? So let's bring deer into the equation at this point. And this was a project done primarily by two undergraduates in my lab, Justin Minette and Noah Kashkarian. And our goal here was to understand deer browsing preferences among different saplings of different tree species in the Kansas cross timbers, to look at some spatial patterns in deer browsing intensity, and to investigate the possibility of associational effects. So our specific questions were, what is the relative importance of landscape features versus individual plant traits in determining browsing intensity? And we really had one individual plant trait, which was the height of the sapling. And we had two landscape factors, which was proximity to a woodland grassland edge and proximity to an established deer trail. The second question is, what tree species are highly selected browse by white-tailed deer in the Kansas cross timbers woodlands? What does it seem they browse disproportionately to its abundance? And third, how does the species composition of the neighborhood around a sapling affect that sapling, the intensity of browsing on that sapling? And when we're talking about the species composition around a post oak sapling here, I'm only referring to the species composition of other saplings. We didn't do anything with the understory species, herbaceous species composition. So our methods for this study were, we had 3 sites in the cross timbers, and we collected browsing data along 5 200-meter transects extending from a woodland grassland edge into a woodland at each of the 3 sites. At 10-meter intervals along each transect, the nearest sapling to that point became our focal sapling, and all saplings within a 10-meter squared circle around the focal sapling were sampled for their species identity, for their height, the number of stems that compose the sapling, because in the cross timbers, maybe this is true in many forests, but certainly in these where they get burned some, saplings will often be multi-stemmed emerging from the soil surface, so the number of stems within the sapling, and then the number of stems that are browsed on the sapling. And we quantified browse intensity as the proportion of stems browsed per sapling. So maybe this sapling had, we've seen some that have up to 11 stems surrounding from what emerging from what seems to be a common rootstock. And maybe 3 of them were browsed, so the browse intensity would be divided by 11. So the height of the sapling was a good predictor of browse intensity on the sapling. Browse intensity increased as the height of the tallest stem in the sapling increased. These points represent all of our data points, which is about 1,200 different saplings. The reason these lines are so low on this graph is because they're fit for post oak. Post oak was a relatively unselected species, okay? So these lines actually model the relationship between sapling height and browse intensity, specifically for post oak, although there was a significant relationship when you considered all saplings. And I'll point out these sites. This is Quercus Scout Ranch in Chautauqua County near Sedan, Stott's Ranch, which is a private ranch in eastern Elk County, and Woodson Wildlife Area in southern Woodson County. Browse intensity also was strongly predicted by distance from a woodland grassland edge. And once again, the lines are for post oak, but we saw a decrease as you got further from the woodland grassland edge, more into the interior of the woodland, browse intensity went down. And as we've submitted this for review, one reviewer has said, well, we should quantify effect sizes and not just significance. And what we found by doing that was the effect size of sapling height was about twice, the effect size and distance from edge, our landscape variable, was about twice that of sapling height. As it turned out, proximity to a deer trail in this system didn't have much explanatory ability. When we look at use of different, I shouldn't say use, when we look at selection of different sapling species by deer, basically use is in relation to abundance or availability, post oak actually turns out to be a relatively unselected species, okay? QUST for Quercus stellata. The only things that were selected as much or less than post oak were blackjack oak, which was selected less than post oak, at least statistically so. But of course, our sample sizes are very large for those two, so a small difference is significant there. And eastern red cedar, it was browsed the least, but we had a pretty small sample size for that one. When we look at the things that are being selected to the greatest extent, Osage Orange, oddly enough, gets selected at quite a high rate. Chinkapin oak. So among the oaks, there's a lot of variation apparently in selection. Chinkapin is something the deer select quite at a high rate, whereas post and blackjack, not as much. The elms were selected at a high rate. The hickories were selected at a high rate. Black cherry was significantly more selected than post oak. And I guess persimmon was also sort of in this category along with post oak. And this was something that was of interest to us. We were looking at whether the browse intensity on post oak was a function of the species composition of the saplings that occurred within that 10-meter circle. And so we kind of divided saplings into what we called more selected and less selected. More selected if they were used, selected at a statistically significantly higher rate than post oak, and less selected if they were selected at a statistically significantly lower rate than post oak. And we looked at the overall stem density within the neighborhood, the density of other post oaks within the neighborhood, the density of preferred species, the density of less preferred species, the frequency of preferred species, and the frequency of less preferred species. So frequency would be, the proportion of stems in that area that are of a more preferred species, whereas density is simply a count of the number of stems. And the only thing that was really predictive was the frequency of more selected browse species, okay? So if post oak, for example, if it was the only post oak surrounded by Osage Orange, that post oak would have a fairly high probability of being browsed. And the probability of a single post oak being browsed surrounded by 4 Osage Orange was greater than the probability of 1 of 4 post oaks being browsed if surrounded by 4 Osage Orange. So it's really a function of the frequency of the more selected browse species and not the overall density, which was interesting to us. We initially tried to explain that as apparency, that sort of this higher frequency of more selected browse sort of created a greater flag that deer could hone in on, but we've been told that apparently reviewers don't think that's a good mechanism with mammals, that mammals, they say, will find it regardless of where it is. So we're looking more at perhaps energy maximization or possibly nutrient balance as explanations for why frequency seems to be an important variable here. So our conclusions from this study were that a landscape variable, distance to habitat edge, more strongly affected sapling browse intensity than did an individual plant trait, sapling height. The 2 dominant oak species are relatively less selected browse. Many of the mesophytic tree species are browsed significantly more than post oak or blackjack oak. And post oak appears to suffer associational susceptibility with increased frequency of more selected browse in the local neighborhood. So the final project I want to tell you about is the experiment that Bev Corey started as part of her thesis and that I've continued collecting data on, which is to look at the joint effects of light and deer browsing on the performance of post oak saplings. This experiment really had 4 questions. First of all, does juvenile post oak growth and survival increase with canopy gap size and light availability? Does the deer population in the Kansas cross timbers reduce post oak growth and survival? Do effects of deer herbivory on post oak performance vary with canopy gap size and light availability? And following fire, how do deer herbivory, light availability, and their interaction affect regrowth of resprouting saplings? And I want to make a couple comments with regard to these 3rd and 4th questions. This 3rd one, do effects of deer herbivory on post oak performance vary with canopy gap size and light availability? There's a long-standing debate in plant-animal interactions about the role that resource availability may play in mediating the effects of herbivores. The question is basically, do herbivores have larger effects upon plant performance under high resource conditions or low resource conditions? So that was what kind of motivated this question, because light is an important resource here, and we were interested in whether deer had greater or lesser effects upon performance of post oaks in high versus low light environments. And then with regard to this fourth point, following fire, how do deer herbivory, light availability, and interaction affect regrowth of resprouting saplings? About a couple weeks even after Bev set up this experiment, there was a prescribed fire at the site. We didn't expect this. We didn't know this was going to happen, but it happened. And about 76% of the experimental saplings were top killed and thereafter regrew from the soil surface. And initially this seemed like a bad thing, but it's actually led to some of our more interesting results as we can look at how deer and light have affected their basically recovery from the fire as they go back, try to sort of re-achieve their pre-fire state. So this was started in March of 2016. The fire was early April 2016. Our methods were we had a deer exclusion treatment and a canopy gap size treatment that were applied to naturally occurring post-oak saplings in a factorial design. Our exclosures were small. Basically, they were cylinders of wire, cylinders of fencing that surrounded a focal or an experimental post oak. We used naturally occurring canopy gaps, which we divided into large and small categories. And the dividing point was something Bev came up with that really has to do with the amount of light we would expect at the center of a circular gap of a particular size. I think the break point was 154 square meters. We measured light availability above all saplings 3 times per year between June 2016 and September 2019. And we collected hemispherical canopy images in 2019 as well. See that our light measurements were at least correlated with the openness of the canopy. If they weren't, we would have been suspicious of them, but they were. And then from 2016 on through this spring, we've been monitoring sapling survival, height, estimated above ground biomass, and browsing damage. So with regard to the effect of light, one thing we found that the relative change in height of saplings was significantly positively related to light availability of the sapling. So it does seem like light is a limiting resource, at least when it comes to growth in terms of height. The pattern with above ground biomass was a little less clear. There wasn't as strong a relationship between the change in the proportional change in above ground biomass over the 5 years of the experiment and light. And it was really, there were really 2 outlier points that kind of obscured any pattern. So when we look at the intensity of browsing or the frequency of browsing upon our experimental saplings, and these of course are saplings that are not within cages that I'm showing you here. These are saplings that are, exposed to ambient levels of deer browsing. One thing that kind of struck us was it seemed like they weren't getting browsed nearly as much as we might have thought. Here we have the cumulative proportion of stems browsed, and that's basically if you had 11 censuses, we would add up all the stems in a sapling across the 11 censuses. We would add up all the browse stems across the 11 censuses, and we'd take the number of browse stems divided by the total number, cumulative number of stems. And that's what we've got in this first round. And most of our saplings are having less than 20% of their stems browsed. In fact, most are having less than 15% browsed. There are a few that are being browsed at a higher rate, around 30% of stems browsed. And when we look at the frequency of browsing, the number of these censuses out of 11 possible censuses on which we saw fresh browse damage on these saplings, the majority were browsed on, had fresh browse damage on less than 3 of those censuses. But then there were some saplings that got sort of hammered a lot more with 7 or 8 instances of fresh browsing across those 11 censuses. What were the consequences for the performance of these saplings? And something to keep in mind here is 76% of these saplings were top killed in the fire. Okay, so if you see negative patterns, that partly explains why. But I will point out that the top killing was evenly distributed among our controls and our deer excluded. So it's not like it's confounded with these treatments. When you look at all the experimental saplings, those that died back, those that were top killed, and those that were not top killed, access by deer significantly reduced saplings' proportional change in height and above ground biomass. when we look at the proportional change in height, saplings that were exposed to deer basically made no gains in height over those 5 years, whereas saplings that were protected from deer increased by about 30% height. In above ground biomass, it's even more dramatic. In above ground biomass, given that this includes saplings that were top killed, there was actually a decrease of about 20% in above ground biomass of saplings that were exposed to deer, and an increase of about 35% in the biomass of saplings that were protected from deer. And for this group of saplings, there was no evidence of an interaction effect between light availability and deer. In other words, the impact of the deer upon the sapling performance was the same in higher light and lower light environments. However, there was one circumstance where we found some evidence for a possible interaction between resource availability and herbivory, and that was among the subset of saplings that were top killed and were resprouting. Okay? So in this group of saplings that have been top killed and were resprouting, there was at least a marginally significant pattern for greater effects of deer herbivory in higher light environments. Okay? So here are saplings that are resprouting in higher light environments and saplings that are resprouting in lower light environments. And the disparity between deer protection from deer and access by deer is greater in these high than low light environments. You can see what seems to be going on here is that in low light environments, even if they're protected from deer, they're not really growing that much. And so the penalty of being browsed may not be that great. In the high light environments, when they're protected from deer, they do have the opportunity to grow rapidly. Okay? And I think a key point here is these are the resprouting saplings, and these resprouts are growing exceptionally rapidly anyhow. They're making up height basically as fast as they can. And if you have interest in this debate about whether herbivores have stronger effects upon plants in high versus low resource conditions, one sort of seminal paper in this area is by Hilbert from 1981. And Hilbert makes the argument that sort of counterintuitively, you should find herbivores having the greatest effect upon plant performance in high resource environments. And the argument Hilbert makes is that in high resource environments, there's a greater penalty to suffering herbivory. Your neighbors are growing really fast. So if you suffer herbivory, you're set back to a greater extent. And I think that's relevant because these are not only growing in high light conditions, but they're also the subset of saplings that are growing most rapidly because they are resprouts that were top killed in a fire. And finally, when we look at the effect of deer upon recovery after the fire, what we see is that the presence of deer delays the recovery of these saplings, both in height and in above ground biomass. So these circles are saplings that are protected from deer. The squares are saplings that are exposed to deer. These are 95% confidence limits here. Okay? So what we see is that protected saplings re-achieve their pre-fire height after 3 growing seasons, and they re-achieve their pre-fire above ground biomass after 3 growing seasons. By contrast, and after 5 growing seasons, they actually are significantly greater in both height and above ground biomass. For saplings that are exposed to deer, they didn't re-achieve their pre-fire height until 5 growing seasons. In the case of above ground biomass, the confidence limit overlaps 0 after 4 growing seasons, but the presence of deer is delaying recovery of the saplings in height by 2 growing seasons and in above ground biomass by 1 growing season. And I think this has some interesting management implications because it may give us some calibration of prescribed fire frequency. Under these types of browsing intensities, if you want post-oak regeneration, you probably don't want a fire return interval that's less than 5 years. Because if you do, they're never recovering to their pre-fire size. On the other hand, if your goal is some sort of oak savanna, you can probably achieve that in the system with a return interval of about 3 years. So our conclusions were that current rates of deer browsing reduced growth of post-oak saplings, but had no effect upon survival. These saplings seem to be pretty robust. Nobody has died to this point. Effects of deer browsing and light availability are mostly independent of one another, except possibly during rapid height growth and post-fire resprouting. And deer browsing lengthens the time required for resprouting saplings to attain their pre-fire height. So to go back to the two sort of overarching questions or hypotheses that I posed at the beginning of my talk, is mesophication occurring in the Kansas crosstimbers woodlands? The crosstimbers may be of interest in the mesophication context because they are a relatively xeric oak system. And I think the answer that we get is yes, we do think mesophication is occurring, but the rate is probably slowed by preferential deer browsing on mesophytic species and by prescribed fire. And in terms of the future trajectory of these woodlands, a bigger threat than mesophication we think is actually juniper expansion, which has been shown also in some xeric woodlands on the Edwards Plateau as well. And then second, are current deer densities affecting oak regeneration and tree regeneration generally in the Kansas crosstimbers woodlands? And once again, we think the answer is yes. They reduce growth rates of post oak, and we should keep in mind that post oak is a relatively unselected species. This is not something deer apparently really like. So if they're doing this to post oak, what are they doing to things they really like, which in some cases may actually not be a bad thing because they may be mesophytic species. Deer browsing in combination with frequent fire will probably produce more open woodlands, whereas deer browsing with infrequent fire will probably produce a juniper thicket. And so with that, I just want to end by thanking the organizations and people that gave us access to study sites, the Scout Ranch in Chautauqua County, the Stotts family, Kansas Department of Parks and Wildlife. I want to thank John Johnston, who is the manager at Woods and Wildlife there and who's been very helpful and had a lot of interesting conversations about Kansas crosstimbers ecosystems, and Mary Liz Jameson, Greg Hausman, and Brandon Berge, who made comments on the projects and the manuscripts. And these are some of the literature that I referred to in my talk. So thank you very much.
Yeah, so I was wondering, did you or did some organizations like Fish and Wildlife take into deer population?
Yeah. We know something about deer populations. We have pretty precise information on deer populations at Quivira Scout Ranch because they've been, since we started this study, they started doing annual spotlight surveys in the fall. And it has very high deer densities. In fact, it has deer densities that are higher than Chautauqua County as a whole. The other sites, we don't have any better data than just the county level data, because I guess Kansas Parks and Wildlife does a couple of road transects in each county.
Do you have any, I don't know, deer biology, but like, do you have any sense of like, are those different study sites indicative of different deer populations? Using that, like,
yeah,
data.
I think that's probably true. I think QSR is exceptionally high in terms of deer density. I think you know, Stotts Ranch is a private ranch. A QSR actually does, you know, is rented out for hunts as well. It just doesn't seem to be driving down the deer. But I think that like Stotts Ranch is a more open landscape. I would suspect it is lower. So yeah, I think if we do look at the county level deer density, if we can get reasonably decent deer density on the sites, I think we would see a spectrum of deer densities. And yes, that would be an interesting way to look at it. Yeah, Helen.
I always think of it as a tree that the little ones, you know, the weekly fast and higher-minded environments, that I thought it was very well in shade, but it is getting into your woodland with somewhat of a canopy. So is it, you have a sense of how easy they are at actually kind of colonizing a closed canopy?
You know, we do see juvenile cedars in basically as closed canopy gets in that woodland. So it is a somewhat broken canopy, even under closed canopy conditions. There is some light. So it does seem to be able to establish under the canopies and the cross timbers. I remember years ago reading a paper sort of on this, I think it was in Missouri, and I think they were talking about that one advantage the cedar may have is that it's, you know, it's evergreen. So it may, like, as the days start to warm up in the spring, it may be able to start photosynthesizing earlier than some of the deciduous species, and hence the carbon gains it can't get under the closed canopy, it may make up a little bit at odd times of year. At least that's what I remember reading. But we do see some, you know, some establishment under what appear to be relatively closed canopy. Yeah, Craig.
Back when I was thinking plant ecology from Lloyd Holbrook, I remember Lloyd talking about the Chautauqua Hills and how there had been a significant increase in the density of trees in that region, at least in Kansas, the ones that he studied. And then he talked about one of the other big impacts that he had seen, I guess it was post Second World War, probably primarily 50s and 60s, perhaps even into the 70s, was efforts on the part of landowners to try to reduce the cover of woody vegetation in the Chautauqua Hills. And one of the ways in which they were attempting to do that, besides fire, was using defoliants, herbicides. And I wondered if you saw any evidence of that having occurred in any of the areas where you had worked, or if there was any significant impact.
That is interesting, because I have not, while I've not seen that at our study sites in Oklahoma, I have seen areas of cross timbers that look like something like that has happened to them, like they've been defoliated. So I have not, I'm not aware of that having been done at any of our study sites, and I'm not, there aren't, you know, standing dead that would be suggestive of that, for example. So I can't say I've encountered that, but I have seen things in Oklahoma that would make me think that's happened down there.
Yeah, I often wondered how significant the impact might have been on those forests.
Yeah,
at least in Kansas.
That's interesting. I don't know.
Great mystery.
Yeah, there's one paper I've come across which I thought was quite interesting. Was there was a paper from a professor at Wichita State University from the 1950s who had 5 or 6 sites in the Chautauqua Hills, and they quantified just tree species composition. So this was data from 1955 or so. And I think they also had data on density of trees. And I thought it would be a really interesting project if I could relocate where those were to have them re-census 60 years later and see what kind of changes in density and species composition there had been.
All right, well, I think it's a little past time, so
Oh.
let's